Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the
Hi.
final Community of Risk Management event for the year. As you can see, we're already starting to get into Christmas party mode. So, it's never too soon, is what I reckon.
We're planning Christmas drinks as we speak.
Yeah. So, yeah, unfortunately for those aren't based in New South Wales, you can't join us. But anyway, we'll see. All right. Well, look, so thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. Today, we're going to cover the highlights. Oh, there we go. Janine's joining us as well. And she missed the salt and pepper. She would have been definitely down with some instrumental salt and pepper. Yeah. So, there we go. Gotcha. Hey, Janine, how you going? Yeah, look, so thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be doing highlights and lowlights in a way of risk management of 2021. And then we've also got a wonderful special guest with us today, Carolyn Snow, up in hopefully the top left there. And we'll give you a brief on background in a moment on Carolyn. But Carolyn's going to talk to us about some exciting predictions for the future in the M&A space, and as well as some excellent data and detail on what's been happening in that space. So look, highlights and lowlights from my perspective in terms of risk management for the year that has been, and I think without shamelessly self-promoting, Rupert and Bron and myself delivered a pretty, how would you call it, pertinent discussion paper earlier in the year that did happen to identify a lot of these issues pretty early in terms of emerging and emergent risks. But highlights for me in terms of risk management for 2021, and hopefully for most of the rest of us in the room as well, would have to be the fact that organisations have been forced to find an ability to collaborate and perform in challenging times and, across geographies, sectors, all that sort of stuff. I think most of us that are in the room here today, given that we represent a broad range of states in Australia and then internationally as well, a testament to the fact that we've just had to learn how to do that. So that's certainly a highlight for me. And I think, Janine, no doubt you'd speak the same as we would in terms of having to be really flexible and adaptable when it comes to things like the HunterNet Future Leaders program we've all the three of us have recently been part of, in that the poor teams that started the program never anticipated that they were going to have to deliver the whole program online, but yet they delivered most of it in a setting like this. So there you go. That's one highlight. Second highlight is, I think there's been this big shift in organisations to move towards collaborating and focusing on achievements and outcomes, and moving right away from, certainly for some of the more well-established organisations, a fairly entrenched pattern of micromanagement and, I guess, Bron, you could call it presenteeism, all that sort of stuff as well, where people were in offices and they were sort of just there doing time. I think the highlight for me is the fact that for people that aren't even in senior or executive roles, there's been this elevated sense of needing to let organisations run based on outcomes rather than on, let's just call it micromanagement. Lowlights, I would say, is there's just been an absolute proliferation and escalation of fraud events within businesses. And I think you only have to start trawling your mind through what's been in the Financial Review, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian, and all the rest over the course of 2021 in terms of financial scandals, whether they be in private sector entities and increasingly in not-for-profit entities. That's a low light for us, given that there's a lot of organisations out there delivering critical frontline services to disenfranchised, vulnerable parts of the community. And there's people in those organisations seeking to defraud either their own organisation, and there's actors from external entities also trying to defraud. And the second low light leading in with that would be cybercrime. And I think no doubt everyone in this room is really familiar and across that, but cybercrime, what more do we need to say? I think it's like 52% elevated incidents, 52% increase in reported incidents to the Australian cybercrime regulator within the first 3 months of COVID. And certainly that's kind of bounced along at a progressively elevating scale for most of the preceding period after that. So that's my highlights and lowlights.
Okay, so with the community of risk management, I want to take a moment to talk about the year in review, because when we think back to February 2020, we've covered, sorry, 2021, I don't even know what year I'm in, we've covered quite a lot of ground. So you think about in the beginning, we covered our paper that James has talked about, we co-authored with Rupert on emerging risks. In that we outlined risks around working from home, other people-related risk in relation to psychological safety. We covered cybercrime, fraud, workplace health and safety, all of which have seen increases as we've moved throughout the year. Then later in the year, we took a deeper dive into these topics, as well as discussing insurance-related risk, business changes and insolvencies, psychosocial hazards in the workplace. We also had a fantastic debate between Ali and Theo on privacy versus public safety. And of course, it wouldn't have been 2021 without discussions on COVID. And early in the year, I'll try not to set him off. Yeah. Earlier in the year, we discussed the paper that we co-authored with Chris from Hickson's on preparing your organisation for the vaccine rollout. And more recently, we conducted some sessions on mandating the vaccine for workplaces. And of course, throughout the year, Chris has done a fantastic job of keeping us all up to date with how workers' comp claims have escalated and issues associated with COVID and workers' comp for both physical safety and psychological safety. So thank you to Chris and to Rupert for the fantastic contribution you both continue to make to our community of risk management. So then we think about what could be different in 2022. So some of the issues that, as James and I talk to our clients and other businesses, there's a number of issues that continue to emerge and be raised with us. So that is things like the ability to attract and retain skilled workers across the board, but certainly in a lot of industries like disability, aged care and hospitality. There is this growing and rising voice around the Great Resignation and what impacts that might have for us, whether we believe that or not, but that is certainly growing in terms of a voice. There's demands by workers to work differently with flexibility now firmly established, and it's real flexibility. It's not quasi flexibility as we might have seen in the past. And as James alluded to earlier, there is a focus now on achieving outputs rather than just presenting in the office. And this is certainly going to be how things are going to be moving forward. These issues have caused organisations to have more targeted people strategies and to get creative around how they attract and retain people in order to ensure the viability of your organisation. There's also the importance of demonstrating your organisational stance on the environment and sustainability as we think about the impact of climate change. And then that clearer, more defined link between work and worker wellbeing and the need for organisations to support worker psychological safety. So these are things that we believe are issues that are going to stay with us as we move into 22. There are also risks associated with supply chain and receiving stocks and goods. Insurance-related risk is not going to go away, and that's not just the premium, that's the ability to actually achieve insurance. And then the economic environment, the impacts this will have on us as we potentially enter into a period of economic instability, both personally and also for our businesses. So these are some of the things that we think about as we move into 2022.
Okay, so look, just two quick wrap-up anecdotes and then I'm going to move on to Carolyn. And also just a reminder for those of us that might be new to the group, this is a Chatham House rules space, so speak your mind, speak freely, but obviously be respectful and, polite towards others. These sessions are recorded and we do like to take a little cheeky happy snap or two. So I might have already taken 10, and my dream, as I always say, is to get everybody with their eyes closed, but I still
I reckon we should do a thumbs up already. Yeah. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3.
What's that?
Yay!
Thumbs up. Yeah, there you go. I was going to say, oh, maybe that'll be better, but I doubt it.
So we've got everyone looking forward then, at least.
Yeah. And look, so two really quick anecdotes. So we obviously can't share too much in terms of specifics. In the last week, to Bronwyn's first point around insurance, we've been working with a client that literally has a total inability to achieve some significant policies at all. We're not talking about workers' comp insurance. We're talking about, let's call it fixed asset and liability insurance, property, all that sort of stuff. We're talking straight out, cannot get insurance over their infrastructure and assets. That's a really sort of pertinent front of mind issue.
Significant risk.
Yeah. Then secondly, we've also been involved and working with one of our clients in another state that's subject to a mandatory COVID vaccination ruling for certain workers in certain sectors. And over the course of the next week, we probably will see the first specific termination in that jurisdiction as a result of a worker who cannot provide a legitimate medical contraindication in relation to the vaccine and is refusing to get the vaccine in accordance with that direction. Obviously, look, you guys may or may not see that come out in press, but that'll be a really interesting event to see unfold in terms of what that means for precedent in the future. And then, look, what I will leave it at that, and I'll move on to Carolyn. We're really lucky to have Carolyn with us today. And so Carolyn is a friend and colleague and I guess a mutual member of the Governance Institute. Carolyn's also a partner at Denton's Law, or sorry, Denton's, I almost got it wrong, Carolyn. She's got an exceptional background in corporate governance, risk and compliance with a particular specialisation in equity market transactions, and let's call it, broadly speaking, M&A. What I'm going to do is hand over to Carolyn without further, oops, sorry, I'm just letting someone else in, without any further introduction. And Carolyn, take it away. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, James. Yeah, we need to get the organisation name right so that I can make sure my partner draw is correct at the end of the month. So absolutely from Denton's, full stop. So look, good afternoon, everyone, and lovely to have you all on board. I think probably my only rebuttal to James and Bronwyn is absolutely law has had to make a quantum shift in the last 2 years in terms of what our historical attitudes have been around presenteeism and bottoms on seats. And I think we're getting better than that at that, but I do think some of my more gentrified cohorts are still not entirely convinced that time in office does not equate to best use of time. So we'll keep working on that, but certainly the younger cohort are letting us know that they're not very happy about sitting in the very nice premises that we seem to be paying a lot of money for, but we'll work that out. So look, what I'm going to do, and thanks for the introduction, James, is give a really brief and very high level overview of the M&A activity trends over the last 12 months. I'm going to try very hard not to use the contraband word and look at what we can expect to see as we head into the third quarter of the 2022 financial year. So it's been a really big year for M&A, which is a relief because the first half of last year was a little bit depressing for all of the M&A lawyers. As all we did was deal with cap and collar arrangements in our agreements as the markets were sort of trying to reset themselves in terms of what the world looked like. So transactions have been abundant. That's probably the shortest way to describe what's been going on. And that has happened in our view, or in Denton's view, for a variety of reasons. It's interesting to note that 2021 comparatively looks a lot like 2009 in terms of its sentiment and its economic uncertainty. And we've seen that play out in terms of what the deal flow looks like in terms of the volume and the quantum of the transactions. But what we are seeing that is different is that business leaders are confident of a strong economic recovery in the wake of really vast technology adaptation over the past 18 to 20 months. So if we look at the business sentiment reports, what we can see is that NAB now reports a positive 10% sentiment in terms of business leaders. And if we look at that compared to the beginning of this financial year, beginning of last financial year, mid last year, the sentiment was at negative 66. So in terms of what we're looking at in business leaders, and that's the CEOs and the chairs and that suite, is we've obviously had a quantum leap in terms of we've been through the rough of this. We're looking at the market. We need to work out what business as usual is, and let's keep transacting because there are opportunities in the market.
So is that a more positive outlook economically, Caroline? Is that what the sense is there?
Yes, absolutely. So we're seeing there was a lot of sitting on hands last year, and I think that we could all see that. Anyone in industry could see that in terms of we were just trying to work out what the deck looked like. And everyone sort of got to the end of last year, early this year, and went, right, well, we haven't done anything all year. We'd better get cracking. And obviously the world is shifting underneath us. So on the ground, what we're seeing is really highly sought after deals in the technology and innovation space. So they're commanding really competitive bidding and quite amazing premiums to purchase. So we are seeing for the first time in a long time, 5 or 6 bidders in an auction process for these types of acquisitions. So they're looking for targets, the bidders are looking for targets that can accelerate their growth and help them achieve scale and digitize. And what they're generally looking to do is back end in capabilities that they don't have, or they no longer want to outsource because they're worried about supply chain issues. And I think that'll be an emerging trend in terms of supply chain. That is not going to go away in 2022. And I'd be so bold to say we'll still be talking about this in 2023.
Supply chain, I think, Caroline, and I'd value your opinion on this, is something that is potentially unrealised at the moment, but is about to hit in a really big way.
Yeah, look, we've got clients that are trying to get large product out of China, you know, and shipping costs at the moment have gone from $500,000 to $1.5 million, and they can't guarantee a dispatch date from port. So we're seeing real issues, you know, and quite frankly, if we look at that as a shipping cost now, it would have been, if we had the capability to build those things in country, we would have had certainty around supply chain, and it probably would have cost less. So there's a competitive advantage that's being lost in those supply chain issues at the moment. The other real trend we're seeing is around the special purpose acquisition companies, so SPACs, as we call them in the US. Terrible acronym. So what we're seeing globally, and that's been a real trend over the last 3 years, but what we're seeing globally is there's a serious latent supply. On our best estimates, there's about 400 of them that exist in the US, and they are created to literally go and look for targets. They're a bit like the shell companies of yesteryear, but with lots of funding behind them. So PE, venture capital. There's about 400 of them floating around looking for targets at the moment, and we estimate that there's about $500 billion of leveraged capital ready to deploy to the correct targets. So that is a really serious challenge to the traditional corporate and private equity buyers, and that is quite a force to be reckoned with, and we're seeing them as very significant players in the major acquisition market. So if we look at the first half of this calendar year, there were 200 acquisitions globally by SPACs, and 90% of those acquisitions were in the technology sector. So that when we talk about back-ending in capability that we didn't have, or growing our revenue pool or getting certainty around that, that's certainly in our view what's happening there. So that they're making necessary acquisitions to get that competitive advantage.
Can I just check, Carolyn, with that?
Sure.
So why is it that these SPACs, even though it's not a great term, but
it's not a great term.
No, not very PC, but anyway. But yeah, why is it that let's call it your traditional PE, let's call it funds or entities, they're not used to competing against these? Is that really?
They have. It's been a disruptive market, and there are tax advantages in the US around these vehicles.
Yeah.
So they can get themselves listed on the SEC with no assets whatsoever, and go and scurry around for targets. So it's like a cash box. It's the cash box of the early 2000s that the ASX used to allow at some point, but they stopped at that point. So I just saw Bronwyn there. Will the shortage of investments force them to lower their investment bar? I think the answer to that is yes. Yeah. But we're not seeing that just yet. So that's just, we'll just sit and watch that space. But there's consumption.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was just going to say, just following up on that, and it's interesting what you said in terms of they're not actually holding assets, whereas obviously, if you think about traditional private equity investment, it might be diversified across utilities, infrastructure.
Yeah, that's right.
So they've got a competitive advantage that they can just appear and, what did you say, seek and acquire?
Yeah, seek and acquire. So it's like turning up to an auction with a briefcase full of cash.
Wow.
Like that's the equivalent. So we've seen, we've seen that time and time again, certainly in the technology sector this year. So there's really good capital out there. That's probably the key takeaway there. And the buyers are really focused on value creation and revenue growth. And if we take that piece out of the, oh, Stuart, the accountants do the multiples, not me.
Lawyers
I have a team. I'm not insured to have a, I'm only allowed to use an abacus from time to time. So the multiples are high. They're absolutely high. And it really depends on what type of structure we're moving it in and out of. But all of the sellers seem very happy with what they're hopefully off retiring to the Bahamas with. So the best sectors we've seen are health and IT. And if we take the special purpose acquisition corporations and normal PE out of the equation, 75% of the bidders in the domestic market this year have been local entities. So there's this mirroring, if we take away the top to bottom, of that patriotism and protectionism locally that we've been seeing, and which I think we probably expect to see in a health crisis. We haven't had one that's been nearly as documented as this, but it's not surprising really in terms of where the national sentiment sits. So look, it remains buyer beware, because obviously there's lots of money floating around, and there's lots of people who have developed innovative products in the last 2 or 3 years that they're looking to move along. And from our perspective, because I'm sure Christopher will agree, we value our practicing certificates, the due diligence risk focus still remains on financial due diligence, and what business as usual might look like for the target on a go forward basis, because the last 2 years have been anything but regular, and those financial statements might be skewed. So that's a really big chunk. The financial DD at the moment is, let's make sure we're not buying at the top of the market, that the multiples aren't too high, but what we've got underneath is a really solid base to go forward. In terms of risk and compliance, unsurprisingly, everything that we're looking at could be broadly described as ESG. But there's absolutely nothing remarkable about what I'm going to tell you next. So we are looking at, in the relevant industries, net zero targets, sustainability, and whether that's perceived or actual, and whether that perception comes from actual genuine stakeholders, the community, or a noisy minority. The other things we're looking at is wage inclusion, diversity, wage inequality, diversity and inclusion. And that's just an interesting piece. Obviously for our listed clients, they've got reporting obligations around that. There's lots of best practice around that, but it certainly has come back to the fore. Modern slavery is obviously another huge issue that we're looking at in terms of compliance, especially in terms of directors that are coming on board and don't want retrospective liability for things that might not be that great. And then our really big piece, and we can all just nod together, is staff retention and attraction. I'm spending most of my days in partnership talking about this at the moment. The struggle is real. So if we cut it back and look at the fact that what we know from the metrics is that 3 out of 5 people who either lost their jobs or had their hours significantly reduced in the last 2 years were women. And of those women, 90% of them who suffered the greatest loss came from a minority group. So a subset of female as a minority group. So we're looking at retail, we're looking at hospitality, we're looking at aged care. So in those sectors, there's a huge skew in terms of what are we doing about those workers? How are we getting them back? How do we cope with the great resignation? Although we like to call it the great retention challenge, because we're always looking at the opposite of that. And what do we do to actually get that back to some sort of equilibrium? So how do we balance that in terms of ongoing flexibility, like especially in professional services where flexibility remains for some a really, really uncomfortable place to be, despite all of the raw data. Like I can sit here and talk about law and go, we account for our time in 6-minute units. I know what my staff are doing every single day, and there is still a cohort of partners in law firms that don't think that their staff are working from home, despite the fact that they book 6-minute units across a whole entire day. And look, if I talk to my cohorts, in accounting and merchant banking and investment banking, the same thing is applying. So I think our clients are well ahead of us in terms of recognising that bottom on seat doesn't equal outcome.
A generational thing, do you think?
Yeah, yes, I was going to step there very carefully and go, it's absolutely a generational thing, and it is
not
time
being
to retire.
Boomers.
Get
Yeah.
out.
Well, look, it's an interesting proposition, and we've been talking about it very frankly here at Denton's, in terms of there is a cohort of partners who may have spent 10 years longer in the law because perhaps their investments in the last financial crisis weren't that kind to them. And therefore they had to pay off their houses. And we're like, if it's, I don't know about any of the other lawyers in the room, but I do not want to still be a lawyer at 73. That's not on my list of things to do. So it's time to go. So look, so that's an interesting bit. Like we talk about the Great Resignation at a junior cohort level, and what are we doing to attract them? But we're also looking at how do we properly reset the decks? And the last 2 years have opened wide some of the cultural issues that have been simmering away and have been ignored because most professional services firms are performance-based.
Yeah.
And the financial performance was an adequate cover for some of the attitudes that didn't really sit well with where we need a modern organisation to sit. So that's just a curious piece. I think the Great Resignation has a twofold bit, and I know certainly in law there's been some self-selection, not at my firm, but there's been some self-selection in other firms that I'm quite familiar with, where it's just that, that they didn't know how to go home and work without a dedicated PA, or they didn't have a computer at home because they'd actually never worked at home before. So there's curious flex, and I don't think I can be nearly as naive to think law is the only profession that's struggling with that. Our clients are much better at it than we are.
Mm.
So if we step back out of there and go back to what are the other issues we're looking at, safety and privacy. So how do we manage our staff? What do the safety protocols look like? What are our clients expecting in terms of safety protocols when they turn up at our office or we turn up at their office? And for us, that's really pertinent in terms of our Pacific presence. So we've got offices in Polynesia, Micronesia and PNG. And some of those countries or some of those islands have vaccination rates at sub 1%. And we have teams of lawyers that we send from Australia to go and work on those transactions. We've got a very large transaction in PNG at the moment. And I was just sharing with James and Bronwyn that for 5 hours yesterday, they were locked in their offices, in their building in PNG because there was an active COVID case, and they weren't allowed to use the common areas, which is where the bathrooms were. So that's just a bit challenging in terms of how do we manage the safety of staff? How do we manage their well-being? How do we all, for example, get them back on the last flight to Australia on Monday, negative of COVID, so they can get home to their families by Christmas? So there's real structural issues in terms of how do you keep staff safe? How do we keep servicing our clients? And how do we deal with those clients who still think that physical presence is the best way to get a deal done? And look, in some cases, that is the best way to get a deal done, especially in some of these the island nations. But it brings with it its own risks, especially if we're sending them there.
Yeah. Just before you move on,
yes,
could we just throw back to Janine's question as well? So,
sorry, that has disappeared off my
screen.
screen.
No, that's right. So it's just, Karen, do you see a shift in DEI moving towards equity instead of just equality? Was the question from Janine.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Personal view is I think I'd like it to. I'd absolutely like it to move to equity over equality. Do I think we're juggling a million things at once and that might be a little bit further away than it should be? I think the answer to that is yes. So that's probably where I sit. And that's one of my other roles is I actually sit on the board of a not-for-profit that runs educational services for children with disabilities. So I could do a whole other session where I got on a soapbox about what I think equity looks like and employability around that equity piece. But I think for the moment, if we reflect back on the Me Too movement and what else is going on, I think we'll be at equality for a while.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Jeanette. I was just going to make a quick comment as well because it was made me chuckle inside and think of my dad. So he's a 73-year-old qualified lawyer, and it is a generational thing. So nailed it. So he's never worked at home before. No, he comes from the era, and it's probably only something that's meaningful to lawyers in the room. He's used to dictating using a dictaphone and like a bunch of those hideous yellow pads.
I dictate, okay, like it's not at all.
Yeah,
fun.
so
The 80s called.
yeah, that's right.
Oh,
And
they
then
dictaphone
and then also too, what I was going to say, and I know Chris is with me on this, is that, and I'm certainly not suggesting you or your practice, Carolyn, but in the grand scheme of some lawyers, they're fantastic lawyers, but they're not so great at actually running or growing a business.
Yeah.
And my dad's a perfect example, and I know he's not the only one in his generation, in his profession, that I ask him at times what I would regard as pretty basic business premise questions that he doesn't answer, because in his mind, I'm a lawyer and that's all I do, and that's all I'm ever going to be. And so anyway, I reckon he knows.
Look, look, and I describe it as, and Chris, feel free to jump in. I describe it as about 20 years ago, law stopped being a profession and started being a business.
Yeah.
And I'll describe the 35 to 45-year-old partners. And look, we've got the benefit of the fact that the 73-year-olds brought in the executive consultants to train us, but we have been trained in law as a people business, not law as a reading profession. So I think there's been a split in terms of and it's not a universal thing, but certainly there's been a split in the way that we have been trained, understanding that, you know, the days of, if you were a lawyer, you had the same clients for your whole entire life because they came to you, and there was a tradition of staying there. That does not exist. So we are business people who are subject matter experts within a network. So I think it's quite a different tilt, and I've watched that change in my career. You know, when I started as a lawyer, there were partners that sat in their corner office, didn't leave, and the tea lady bought them tea, biscuits and their lunch, because that was what you did, because you were important. So anyway,
in that space though, when you talk about that, Caroline, is that, you know, as people, I think it is a generational thing, but I also think there's something in there about working mums as well, and the amount of productivity that they give to an organisation, if the organisation will let them have real flexibility to work around the need, their competing priorities that they've got, with a focus on outputs, not bums on seats, as you say.
Yeah, so there's been a normalising of the flexibility piece in the last 2 years, and that's something that I think as leaders we really have to clutch and keep going with, regardless of industry. That we know that we can trust our people, and if you can't, then you probably need to go off and do some executive education. But we know we can trust our people. We know they can do their job everywhere. For some of us, it's not ideal. I would much prefer to be at the office than at home with my children, especially if I have to homeschool them. There you go. There's my confession for the day. I am done. So look, so for me, I know I work better in the office, but I'd also like the flexibility of not having to work in the office if, you know, I need something done. So that is the great retention piece, is how do we make sure we're attractive to the younger cohort. All right, so if we step back to what are we looking at in terms of ESG, the other piece is fraud, and I think, James, you touched on that perfectly. Our due diligence is looking for fraud. It is doing forensic analysis of what's going on, especially in the not-for-profit space, and that can be employee fraud or an external actor risk fraud. So both of those are really, really cognizant things that things that we're really looking at. What we are seeing too is an increasing trend from incoming financiers and institutional investors to focus on these issues, to ascertain whether even after all that due diligence, they actually fall into the investment mandate. So we're seeing a rise in inquiries from our institutional investors, and our big six financiers are actually stepping themselves out of some industries altogether. And you touch on this, the insurance teams are reporting absolutely the same. I also have some clients who are staring down the barrel of being uninsurable when their policies are due to renew in March and April of next year. So it's obviously really still hard going for some particular sectors, and we're seeing low-level M&A here, but I'll describe it as survival M&A. So they are merging and acquiring. It's either opportunistic or their businesses are failing. So unsurprisingly, tourism and leisure assets, and especially in Queensland and Western Australia, where there's been those hard borders, where tourism is one of their key criteria. Airline manufacturers are in dire straits. although I suspect we'll find lots of rusted parts once we finally get all of those fleets back up in the air. The cruise operators, I don't know what a comeback looks like for them, and the merger and acquisition activity there is mainly around core suppliers, and there's been some private equity pieces moving around, but I think that's going to be grim for some time. I could take a snap poll and go, who's planning a cruise? None of us are planning none of us are planning cruises, right? Cinemas and theme parks. So we saw the Village Roadshow PE, the private equity acquisition of Village Roadshow finally complete this earlier this year. So things like that, they're coming off the listed bourse because it's just too hard. And the other key piece we're seeing in M&A activity is education providers. They have done it rough. So in terms of what's keeping M&A lawyers up at night, broadly, we don't sleep. There's enough memes to talk to you about that. But what we're closely watching at the moment are uninsurable markets. So we're seeing new markets become uninsurable for the first time. I've got a funds management client at the moment who can't get PI insurance. Like, blows my mind. What we are doing in response to that, and what we're seeing in our funds management space, is we're working with some insurers to set up alternative risk transfer models. So they are making a comeback in terms of some of the disruptive financial services players. So that's an interesting space to watch. And I think what we'll certainly find in the first half of next year is see some very big players out of the insurance model and into the ART model. We're seeing restricted investment markets, and that comes back to the social response around some of those ESG issues. We're watching crypto and digital asset platforms and the regulation of that really closely. That there's obviously been a lot of press about that. We've had the Senate report come out late October, and we've had the ASIC chair be very, very vocal about the fact that he doesn't think that they are a viable market that would like to be regulated in Australia. And then we've seen, companies like Banxa, step out of the ASX, will not be able to get themselves listed on the ASX and step onto the SGX. So there's risks in terms of our regulators deciding that that's just prohibited conduct, and that's my words, it's not quite that strong, but certainly pushing them out. And that conduct looks very similar to the conduct of the ASX sort of mid last decade, where the variable interest entities that were listed on the ASX just disappeared because they were regulated to within an inch of their lives. So that's that passive policy, that passive aggressive policy where we see a push out because they can't get listed, because they can't get over the listing committee, or ASIC won't approve their prospectus. So that it's that quiet regulation within the existing parameters that's becoming a bit challenging. More generally, we're a bit worried about tax policy, inflation and government spending, but I think the whole world probably is. And then we've got the upcoming federal election and FIRB policy and what might fall out of that. So we are already stepping into a phase where we're expecting the Foreign Investment Review Board to go into what we'll describe as caretaker mode. And that generally happens about 6 months before we go into an election, where they stop making decisions under FIRB policy. Because they're just not sure what the next government might do. Locally, and I've touched on this, the things we're grappling with are the operation of our national organisations under differing health orders and requirements on a go-forward basis. The Sino-Australian relationship still remains of concern to us. We're very carefully monitoring political lobbying around, and when I talk about that, I think Crown Casino, property developers, relationships with large unions and their aligned party members, that has, in terms of mergers, acquisitions and regulation, that can have real impact in the lead up to a federal election. And then last but not least, and what a bit to finish on, our net zero target and the presentation of Australia internationally in that regard, that's, we're the world's largest law firm, and I can tell you that I am sitting on global calls at the moment where we are being mocked post COP26. So that just remains a challenge in terms of international investors into Australia, and how that presents, and how we can save face at the table with other players in transactions, and talk to them actually in a meaningful way about ESG, because globally we've got a difficult representation.
Do you think I'm not using the what do you call it, the prohibited word, but do you think that prohibited word and our view globally has influenced our standing? Because I think we spoke earlier in the year about, and I'm using my words here, that I guess categorically most of us in the business community feel like our governments are like the drunk uncle at a wedding. And we're pretty much...
I think we called it bad Santa at ours, but yes, I understand. The analogy is the same.
Just lurching around the place.
Yeah.
And so do you think that has, I guess, that being viewed externally by international entities, do you think that's reduced our standing from a foreign investment perspective at all, as well, in amongst all that?
Yeah, look, it's not coming up in conversations. I can really only speak to the discussions that I'm sitting in. So it's not coming up in my conversations.
Yeah.
Like, I'm in Queensland. I get mocked every time when they ask me how am I going locked in my own state, and I'm getting that from countries, you know, who have been dealing with apartheid. So it's difficult.
Yeah.
Good news is I'm pretty good at the self-effacing jokes. So look, I don't. That's not coming up as a theme in my discussions. Certainly, despite domestically what we think about our vaccine rollout, it's fairly well respected globally in discussions. We've obviously done pretty well in terms of, you know, death rates and how that's been presented. But look, I think there's some jurisdictions that just don't care.
Yeah.
Or they've just gotten over it much more quickly. That we talked to our US counterparts, and they, like, it's rampant and they're not really that concerned, or if they are concerned, they're certainly not expressing it in any way in a very you know, in a very safe forum.
Okay. And then I guess just to close, big, you know, Carolyn's top 3 predictions for 2022.
Yeah, okay, good question. Like, the COP26 outcomes is going to be number one, that we need to have something meaningful, and I think that will colour everything else. So it's going to colour the election. I think we're going to see a lot more special purpose acquisition company investment in Australia, so that cash box in, especially now that I think we can at least fly into New South Wales. So, you know, the PE, the VCs and the PE firms and the investors in those companies can actually arrive. So I certainly know one of my key international clients was in Sydney last Friday for lunch because they could get into the country. So I think there will be huge M&A activity next year based on the fact that the best way to close these deals is actually to be in a room. Understanding that that's the complete opposite of the presenteeism argument we've been talking about. But some of those big deals have been on slow burn because they need what will be the result of the election. Stuart, I have no view. Absolutely no view.
Caroline's crystal ball.
Yeah, that's right. No, look, I think, so circling back, so COP26 outcomes, the closing of really big deals, and there are some really, really big deals in the pipeline, both in Australia and in the Pacific Islands. And something I didn't really touch upon was obviously the Australian investment in the Pacific Islands. So so, you know, we've obviously got the PACER Plus investment that Australia is investing in Micronesia, Polynesia, and the like. So we're seeing some competitive angles in terms of Australian investment in markets that have for the last 5 or 6 years certainly been funded by our Asian counterparts, and that obviously has a political slant to it that I don't propose to touch because the first 2 characters of my firm name are indeed Chinese characters. So that's just a little bit fraught with danger. But I do think that will be the flavour of what is going on in terms of the M&A market, and certainly political spending as we lead up to there. Yeah.
Okay. And look, you've nailed it there, Bronwyn. You know, how do you know when a politician's lying? Their mouth's open and words coming out. So I think that's the answer. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Absolutely.
So look, just so we can, because I know there will be a lot of questions here. I might, if you're okay with it, we'll leave it with that, Carolyn. And,
that's fine. No, I'm perfect.
Yeah, and that was fantastic. And what I know we all particularly appreciate is those real and meaningful statistics and numbers, because you know, you probably know by now that this room, we're not we're not in here to talk sort of fluff, even though we like to have fun. We want to talk about real issues and take real action. So fantastic. Can't thank you enough.
That's right.
What I'll do is throw to open questions. But yeah, thank you again, Carolyn. Really,
my pleasure.
You taking the time. And look, if you want to chat box them or if you want to just throw them out, I know, Chris, you look like you had one ready to go there. And Stuart's done a lot of bantering. I feel like he needs to come through with a question straight after, just to.
Oh, Stuart, will a change of government reduce the interest of special purpose companies in Australia? I think the answer to that's no, unless there's a FIRB policy piece in it. So if it's an acquisition that can be pushed through under the FIRB regulations, like actually under the actual act, then it would appear that the government's pretty agnostic as to what type of vehicle is acquiring that asset, as long as on a look-through basis that we don't have any state actors or any prescribed entities that are of interest, because that will flick it over into FIRB policy. And FIRB policy is just the Wild West, really. Like that, we just don't really know what's ever going to spit out of it. It's a bit like going to the ASIC regulatory group. You just cross your fingers and hope for the best.
And then Bronwyn was asking as well, saying, yeah, does the rise of SPACs frighten you given the experience of the 1980s?
So I was in primary school in the 1980s, so I've read about this.
Weren't we all?
Weren't we all? Look, the short answer is yes, but I don't think this particular type of entity scares me more than any other type of investment entities. So, the venture capital limited partnerships, the funds that are put together for a significant, for the purposes of significant investor visas. I think all of them have got pros and cons. I just think it's our job to make sure that, when they acquire, that we get the right approvals, and that I'm stepping very carefully here. So I don't think that the type of the entity is not really keeping me up at night, but I think it's just interesting where the tax advantage is being where it's being gained based on the type of vehicle that's entering as a foreign investor in Australia.
Great, thanks. Who's next? Chris?
I didn't have any question. I just was going to agree with Caroline and what she was saying about law firms and their age division and evolution. I think a lot of it's probably been client driven as well, with that expectation to go beyond just your little niche and that more trusted advisor style of role. So yeah, and I also hate homeschooling. So there was an agreement phase there, that's all. Yeah.
Okay, agree. That's your agreement face, Chris. Not
Yes.
Got it.
Red hot tip: being on the board of an education institution, the teachers hate homeschooling as well, even though they don't have the students. So it's pretty interesting to do an after action review of the fact that everyone just hated it.
Yeah.
Must not be the teachers in Newcastle, because all I was doing was like having them hassle me in the surf, and I'm like, aren't you paid to teach my kids?
Oh, you doing surf, weren't you?
What were you doing in the surf, James?
Maybe that's why they were hassling you, mate.
I may have given away my dead giveaway, Chris. So yeah, who else has got a comment or an observation? Because I know there was a lot of meat in that, Carolyn, and I've got a ton of stuff rattling around my head, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. So Rupert, is there a comment or an observation you've got to throw out there, mate?
I mean, there could be loads. I think from the Asia perspective, one of the things that's tying people in knots a bit is ESG. Not least there's two problems. There's governments or regulators, so the exchange here has come out with this big list for the E part that you've got to demonstrate if you can list, and but nobody really knows how to measure it. So some of it's like, what is your plastic consumption, and how do you dispose of it? And so there's this Japanese company that's trying to list here, and they don't really use plastics, but they have an office, so obviously they do use them, but it's not something they can measure. So on that one point, So people trying to bring in multiple experts, because one of the things I hear from clients, and I don't know whether you hear it as well, Caroline, is they're pretty sick of particularly the big players like the Big Four and all the rest of it suddenly pretending that they can do the E and the S bit when they've spent 30 years doing the G bit, and now suddenly they're just, saying, yeah, we can do it. And so I spoke to a guy who is, he's Bearings head of ESG here for Asia, APAC, and he said that it's a nightmare because they actually, to understand the E bit especially, and the S to a certain extent, you need to get on site. Like if you're going to talk about effluent and waste product and the environmental impact of your operations, that's not something you can do over Zoom.
No,
you can review, G bits of a document review, and you can set up some way that you can do the interviews and understand about implementation. You can do audits, testing systems to actually physically test like emissions. Yeah, so that the ESG is causing people a lot of headaches, but for two reasons. It's complicated and the regulators aren't very clear about what they want. Yeah. And the second thing is that a lot of the advisors are saying they can do things they can't.
Yeah, look, absolutely, that's our experience too. And we're being asked to measure the de minimis, right? Like that, if you take that office example, if that's the only plastic being used, and that's the plastic that the pens come in when you unwrap them.
And the water bottles and the
and the water bottles,
the
I know in our office, because Denton's has an ESG stance, I'm using paper cups because we don't like paper cups and bamboo cutlery. And I think I'm not sure this is making a difference. Like that there's a piece that goes with that there's much bigger issues that we need to do, and we do need to have our boots on the ground. But yeah, look, some of it is just pretty difficult, and I deal a lot with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, so I can appreciate what that looks like. Nothing.
They're
like
good at coming up with lists, but not very good at telling you what to do with that list.
Like they're still in my award for the world's longest teleconference at 9 hours over a prospectus a couple of years ago, and it's like I'm just not sure that we're achieving anything.
We had a interesting experience this week writing for the first tender we've written for that had a specific ESG aspect to it, but particularly modern slavery focus. And this is a coal mine, or a coal mining company. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, interesting.
They're going to have to come up with the spin doctors of the century.
Look, and what our clients are expecting from us in tenders, that we're on the panel of lots of very, very big global and multinational organizations, like what they're expecting us to report on as their lawyers is properly off the charts. We don't know how many ceramic mugs we've got going on vis-a-vis plastic ones. Like that probably won't affect our legal services to you, but obviously it's important to you and we'll report on it. But it's curious, and I do wonder, like we have to collect data for a reason, otherwise it's just useless. And I'm just not sure that the data we're collecting for some of these clients actually is meaningful in any way. But in fun Chatham House rules, disclosure, Denton's in Brisbane have actually just moved to a new floor, and it's actually Adani's old fit out. So we are on the floor that Adani used to occupy, and we had to move out 500 plastic plants to fit our team in. So I'm just not sure they'll be reporting on ESG anytime soon, because there were no live plants. They were all plastic. There was a little bit of irony in that as we shipped them back down to the basement.
Where they will thrive.
Yeah, that's right.
Daniel.
Yeah, I think, ESG has been around for a long time, and the environment bit has been there in that whole time. I think the issue here is not to get stuck in the weeds, and the reality is that sustainable energy is really where it should be at. It's a good thing to do, is to monitor use of waste and its appropriate disposal. But I guess and this is where the issue becomes, and we're suffering this right now in terms of supply chain and the disposal chain. Whereas when you get a product from China or Taiwan or wherever it is, the plastic that comes in it is just ridiculous. And so we need to be looking forward as well as backwards in terms of that supply chain and going, I don't want to receive a product with 2 tons of plastic in it. I want to receive a product that's actually packed appropriately with non-plastics in it. So I think that there needs to be effort at both ends of that chain. But I think, for organisations like mine, Surplus Saving Queensland, we don't even have an environmental policy, which we do have to address. And particularly because our activities are in sensitive areas like beaches and things like that. And we've got, motorised equipment that we use, and they're petrol based and things like that. And so I think, my plan to attack that is certainly not from the micro level around plastics that we dispose of in our office, because I would expect that the Brisbane City Council should be actually attending to that in its recycling, and it says it does. I have 2 separate bins at home, and whether that's true or not, and there is some argument that it's not, that they're not actually doing their bit. And so, that's where we'll be focused on, is the more broader things around our energy usage, our cars that we choose, and things like that, rather than the micro thing about, using bamboo cutlery, which, again, is far less sustainable than using a metal one. And so, that getting into that argument about what plastics are used or what papers are used to tends to be very inane, is what people are saying. So, but I think we should be looking at far more broadly about that supply chain and how that actually impacts and that's only going to be cause effect when we actually look at who packs it and who delivers it and how they do that. And that's where the COP26 is important, to get those, and unfortunately China wasn't involved, to get them involved in saying, well, the plastic has to stop at its source, not at the end of it. And look, we should be doing our bit, but the reality is it shouldn't be delivered in 2 tonne of plastic. That's what we should be doing.
Yeah, totally agree. Look, we're just about to run out of time, so I was just going to check, was there any sort of closing queries or comments from anyone that hasn't had a chance to throw it out there yet? Because it's been a pretty buoyant, positive, lighthearted, yet, informative discussion as always. Yeah, so. Yeah. All right. Well, look, what we'll do is we'll bring it to a close, and I'm sure I speak for everyone again by saying a wonderful thank you to Carolyn. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for the wonderful content, and to all our attendees here, and most of you have been here month in, month out for the year. Thank you for being with us this year.
Thank you for putting up with us every month.
Yeah, thank you for putting up with Bronwyn every month. Yeah.
Oh.
So look, we'll be back. She'll be punching me the moment this camera stops. But look, so we'll be back in February. We're going to be revising the format a little bit, and we'll keep you posted on that. But we hope that everyone has a wonderful and relaxing Christmas and is ready to come out of the blocks, absolutely full tilt in the 2022. Because I suspect it's going to be a big year, and I'm really genuinely hopeful, and I know we both are, it's going to be a lot more positive than this year. So we can hopefully kiss that word.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.